Have you ever heard of paranormal games, the glass game, Charlie Charlie, the Ouija board? Just innocent fun, right? But what if I told you that some of these games never truly end? This is the story of Lucas and his friends, who learned the hard way that some doors, once opened, can never be closed again.
My name is Lucas, and to this day, I still try to forget what happened on that Halloween night in 2013. But some things simply refuse to be forgotten. The idea came from Felipe, of course. He was always the bravest, or the most reckless, of our group. We found the Ouija board in a dusty corner of my basement, hidden behind old boxes that had belonged to my grandmother. I can't explain why, but the moment I touched that board for the first time, a shiver ran down my spine. Something about it didn't feel right. Still, the adrenaline and the laughter of my friends drowned out any hesitation. We sat on the living room floor, with only a single candle burning between us. The silence was almost absolute, broken only by the ticking of the clock on the wall. Felipe placed the glass in the center of the board and told us to put our fingers on it. I'll admit, I thought the whole thing was ridiculous at first. But then he asked the question, if someone is here, give us a sign. For a moment, nothing happened. We exchanged glances, slightly disappointed, ready to laugh at our own foolishness. But then, we heard it. A dull thud coming from upstairs. Like something had fallen. The laughter died on our lips. It was probably the wind, Murillo murmured, trying to sound unconcerned. The windows are closed, I replied without thinking, and then the glass started moving. At first, slowly, sliding as if hesitating, then faster. Our fingers trembled as we followed it across the board, and when it stopped, it spelled a single word: run. The silence that followed was unbearable. I could feel my pulse in my ears, a low buzzing filling the air. Beatrice, the most sensible one among us, was the first to say what we were all thinking. We need to stop. Now. She pulled her fingers away from the glass, and I did the same. But Felipe laughed. That arrogant, defiant laugh of his. Are you guys scared? It was one of you, it had to be. He mocked, looking at each of us. Run? From what? This is nonsense. The moment he said that, the light flickered. Once. Then again. Then everything went dark. It was as if the entire world had gone silent. No sound, except for our heavy breathing. My heart was pounding so hard, it felt like it might explode. And that's when we heard it. Footsteps, coming down the stairs. Someone was descending. Is it your dad? Murillo whispered, but I knew it wasn't. My dad was out of town. My mum was staying at my aunt's that night. The house was empty, except for us. The footsteps got closer, slow, deliberate, as if whoever, or whatever, it was wanted us to hear them. Felipe, who had been laughing moments before, was now shaking so badly he could barely hold his lighter. With trembling hands, I lit the candle again. The warm glow illuminated our pale faces, our wide eyes filled with pure terror. Nothing. There was no one on the stairs, but the feeling that something was there was undeniable. Beatrice was the first to move. She shoved the board aside, grabbed the glass, and flipped it over. It's over. The game is over. Her voice was firm, but her eyes said otherwise. Felipe tried to laugh, but it was an empty sound. He stood up abruptly, muttering something about leaving, and we did. No one argued. No one wanted to stay another second. That night, I slept with all the lights on, but the worst came after. In the days that followed, strange things started happening. Felipe woke up with scratch marks on his body, as if invisible claws had raked his skin during the night. Murillo said he sometimes saw someone standing in the corner of his room, but whenever he turned on the light, there was no one there. Beatrice started receiving calls from an unknown number, but all she ever heard on the other end was heavy breathing. And then, a week after that night, Felipe disappeared for 2 whole hours. When we found him, he was standing in the middle of an abandoned lot, staring blankly into the distance, his lips murmuring words no one could understand. When we shook him, he blinked like he was waking up from a trance and asked where he was. He remembered nothing. That's when we decided to tell a priest in town. He listened carefully, never calling us crazy, and said something that haunts me. To this day, some games are not to be played. When you open that door, something came through, and it may never leave. That same night, we burned the board. But even as I watched the flames consume the wood, I knew it wasn't over. And I was right. 3 months later, on the eve of my birthday, a package was delivered to my front door. No sender, no explanation. It was the Ouija board, and on top of it, a note written in my own handwriting. The game isn't over.
To this day, Lucas swears he never touched the board again. But the real question is, did the board ever stop playing with him? Have you ever played with something you shouldn't have? Share your story in the comments. And be careful. Some games don't end when you want them to. Mirrors reflect more than just our image. They say that if you stare for too long, you might see something, or someone who shouldn't be there. But what if there was a game capable of opening a portal to something much worse? This is the story of Diego and his friends who discovered too late that certain rules should never be broken.
My name is Diego, and to this day I still can't explain what happened that night. But one thing I can guarantee: if you ever find a strange game on the deep web, don't play it. It was just another night in 2015. My friends, Anna, Raphael, and Bruno, and I had a habit of scouring obscure forums in search of bizarre challenges. That's how we found the reflection game. It seemed silly, just another urban legend meant to scare teenagers. The rules were simple. At 3 a.m., stand in front of a mirror in a dark room with only a single candle lit. Stare directly at your reflection and say 3 times, "I am here. Who is there?" If nothing happens, blow out the candle and go to sleep. But if your reflection moves on its own, stop immediately and leave the room. We laughed at it. It sounded like a weaker version of the Ouija board or Bloody Mary. Still, curiosity got the best of us. We decided to play the game at my house, in the upstairs bathroom, the only one with a mirror big enough. Raphael held his phone, ready to record, while Anna carried the candle. The clock read 2:59 a.m. as we took our positions. At exactly 3 a.m., I turned off the light and stared at my own reflection. The candle's flickering flame cast strange shadows across the room, distorting my features. I took a deep breath and began. "I am here. Who is there?" Silence. "I am here. Who is there?" Nothing. "I am here. Who is there?" The candle flickered as if a breeze had passed through, but the bathroom was completely sealed. I glanced at Anna and Raphael, who looked uneasy. Bruno let out a nervous chuckle. "This is ridiculous," he whispered. At first, I agreed, until it happened. When I blinked, my reflection didn't blink back. I stopped breathing. My heart pounded as I stared at my own unmoving reflection, watching me. My eyes were open, empty, like they weren't mine. And then, without me moving, a muscle, it smiled, but I didn't smile. Anna screamed and dropped the candle. The room went pitch black. Raphael cursed under his breath as he fumbled to turn on his phone's flashlight. My chest rose and fell in panic. This wasn't normal. This wasn't possible. When we finally lit up the room, the mirror was normal, again. My reflection copied my movements perfectly, just as it should. But something inside me knew it wasn't over. After that night, I started noticing strange things. My reflection seemed delayed, just by a few milliseconds, like a lagging video. At first, I thought it was just paranoia, but then came the dreams. Every night, I dreamed of the bathroom, of the mirror, of myself, standing on the other side, watching me in silence. And with each dream, I was closer to the glass. One night, after waking up drenched in sweat, I looked at the mirror in my room, and there were fingerprints on the surface, as if someone had touched the glass from the other side, but no one else had been in my room. I told Anna everything. She wanted to test something. She brought her camera and made me redo the ritual, this time recording everything. I repeated the words, but nothing happened. At first, we felt relieved. Until we watched the footage. For just a split second on the screen, there were two silhouettes in the mirror. Two. But I was alone. After that, I stopped looking at mirrors. But escaping was impossible. Glass reflects, phone screens reflect, polished surfaces reflect. I couldn't get away. One night, as I stepped into the bathroom, I saw something that made my blood run cold. My reflection had its back turned to me. Stumbled back, my heart pounding against my ribs. Slowly, the reflection began to turn around, but its face wasn't mine. That's when the light flickered, and a dull thud echoed through the bathroom. The candle went out. The screen went black, and the last thing I heard before everything disappeared was a faint, distant laugh coming from the mirror. I was never the same after that night. I still feel it. Something watching me whenever I pass by a reflection, whenever I look into dark glass, whenever I see my own face, and sometimes, when I least expect it, I see him smiling back, and I'm not smiling.
They say that once you start seeing something in the mirror, it can also see you. And if it notices your presence, it might want to switch places. Have you ever seen something strange in the mirror? Share your story in the comments. But remember, never stare for too long. It might be looking back at you. There are legends that hide in forgotten places, small challenges that seem like harmless games until someone decides to play them. The Whisper Game was just another tale from a small town, but on the night Gabriel and his friends played it, they discovered that some voices should never be listened to.
I should have never accepted that challenge, but how could I say no? It was just a stupid legend, something we laughed about on Friday nights. Only now I'd give anything to have never stepped foot in that cabin. My name is Gabriel, and that night my friends Leticia, Marcos, and Julia and I decided to play the Whisper Game. The story was well known in our town. A simple ritual performed in a place where someone had died. If you followed the rules and got lucky, nothing happened. But if something whispered back, well, no one who experienced that ever lived to tell what happened next. We found an abandoned cabin in the forest. People said a man had hanged himself there years ago. The perfect place for a stupid game. The air was heavy, thick with the damp smell of rotting wood. It felt like the very atmosphere didn't want us there. We marked a circle of salt on the floor, just as the rules instructed. Each of us held a lit candle. The wind whistled through the trees, and that alone was enough to make my heart pound. It was 2:59 a.m. when I leaned forward and with a shaky voice whispered, "We hear you. Do you hear us?" Silence. Nothing but the distant sound of the wind outside. I exchanged glances with Leticia. She gave a half smile as if to say, "See? Nothing's happening." And then we heard it, a faint whisper coming from somewhere inside the cabin. "We hear you." Ice flooded my veins. Julia gripped my hand, her candle shaking so much that hot wax dripped onto her fingers. But the worst part came after. "We see you." Julia's candle went out by itself. She let out a strangled gasp and stumbled backward. Nearly falling, Marcos jumped to his feet. "This is just someone messing with us. It's got to be an echo," he said, trying to convince himself. But then the voices started whispering our names. First distant, then closer. Much closer. Gabriel. Leticia, Julia, Marcus. We ran without thinking, without looking back. But the farther we ran, the longer the forest seemed to stretch. The way back felt endless. The air grew thick, hard to breathe. That's when Marcos hit the ground with a horrible scream, like something had grabbed his leg. We rushed to help him, but when his eyes met mine, he was no longer the same. His eyes were hollow, empty. His skin had gone pale, as if something was draining the life from him. "There's something In me. He whispered, his voice breaking. My instincts told me to run, but Leticia and Julia refused to leave him behind, so we tried to drag him back with us. That's when we noticed something terrible. The trees around us were no longer the same. The forest had changed. The whispers were everywhere now, echoing around us like an invisible chorus. And this? Marco started laughing, but his mouth didn't move. I was shaking, trying to keep hold of my candle, which was nearly burned out by then. You heard us. Now we stay. That was the last thing I heard before all the candles went out at once. Darkness swallowed us whole. I don't know how much time passed. All I remember is the sound of footsteps around me, the whispers growing louder and louder, until suddenly everything went silent. When the moonlight broke through the trees, the cabin was empty. No sign of us. They say that on certain nights, if you walk near that forest, you can hear echoes of voices calling for help. But if you hear them, do yourself a favor, never answer.
They say that if you hear a whisper when you're alone, never respond. Because if you do, it might not just be you inside your body anymore. What about you? Have you ever heard voices when you were alone? Share your experience in the comments. But remember, sometimes listening can be the worst mistake. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more real stories like this.